Ladies and gentlemen, with that, it's now time to also introduce our next keynote speaker, who in fact, if I may tell you, has devoted more than 25 years of his career to promoting inclusive and sustainable development internationally. He's also served in various capacities in various parts of the world, and he's also a published author of works in the field of health economics. Ladies and gentlemen, we are truly delighted and truly honored to have with us none other than Shombi Sharp, UN Resident Coordinator in India. So can you please put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen? Please help me welcome on stage Mr. Shombi Sharp. Well, it's time to deep dive into our keynote address. Over to you, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Namaste. मुझे आप सबको मिलकर बहुत अच्छा लगा. On behalf of the United Nations here in India and as representative of the UN Secretary General, it's a great honor to be joining the 5th edition of the Global Sustainability Alliance SDG Summit. I'd like to appreciate and thank the Times Group for organizing this important meeting. If it's about SDGs, then we're extremely excited to join and participate, and especially to thank all of you who have taken your time to be a part of this two-day extravaganza. All of the representatives, leaders of the business community, the international community, diplomats, civil society, and stakeholders. The collective power to move the needle in this room is really quite impressive. Dear friends, as we all know, just a couple of weeks ago, time is moving so fast, but just a couple of weeks ago, the eyes of the world were here on New Delhi. And many of us here had the privilege to engage in the G20 process, throughout the entire process, of course, also the summit, the Leaders' Summit. And just a few days following that, I had the privilege to travel to New York to participate in the General Assembly. Of course, this year being a particularly important milestone General Assembly with the SDG Summit, Climate Ambition Summit, Pandemic Preparedness, high-level meetings, and a number of other meetings happening all at once. So I've just returned early this morning, in fact, so I can say, Gahar vapas aakar acha lag raha hai. Wonderful to be back, and if my voice sounds a bit funny or if I look a bit tired, you know, that's why, but it's very exciting to be here. And while the locations may have changed between New Delhi and New York, the messages were very much the same in New Delhi and in New York. From the world leaders, from civil society, from young people and businesses, all the same, that we face overlapping multiple crises. It's a time of polycrisis. So we must come together now to save our common challenges. And the Sustainable Development Goals remain our best hope, our only blueprint for a more prosperous, green, and peaceful world by 2030. Now halftime is over, the second half has started. And yet, as was mentioned briefly, we are woefully off track. Only 15% of the global SDG targets are on track. Fully a third have either stalled or are now in reverse. As the Secretary General said in New York, the SDGs, this is not just a list of goals. These are the hopes, the dreams, the rights, and the expectations of people everywhere. And especially the people of the Global South, who are paying the highest price for this promise not kept, and yet contributed the least to these problems that we all face. The world now is hungrier than it has been in 2 decades. More than 730 million people simply do not have enough to eat. Almost half of humanity is living in countries, as the Secretary General says, on debt row, which have to spend more money on debt interest payments than they can invest in the health or the education of their people. and we continue to wage war on the planet, and nature is striking back. I think we can see it across the world, what is happening. My return here to Delhi was delayed by Hurricane Ophelia, but everywhere we see fires and floods and catastrophes. Yet, the important note is that there is much reason to have hope. And much of that has to do with India. First of all, India, we estimate, is quite literally home to between 25 and upwards of 50% of some of the global targets. So as India speeds forward in its development, it will do much of the heavy lifting for the rest of humanity in terms of achieving the global SDGs. As the Secretary General noted in his visit here previously, India is the country that can make the SDGs a global reality. Second is India's increasing geopolitical leadership. Last week, on the eve of the SDG Summit, I authored an op-ed in the Hindustan Times titled, "From New Delhi to New York, let's bring the momentum of the G20 to the United Nations." And the New Delhi Declaration, I'm pleased to say, endorsed the most SDG-focused language of any G20 leaders' declaration ever. From key commitments including, for example, the G20 SDG Acceleration Action Plan, the Green Development Pact on climate, lifestyles for environment, as was mentioned, the Prime Minister's initiative, to digitalization, digital public goods, financial inclusion, especially for people in rural areas and women, important reforms of the international financial architecture, to commitments on gender equality and women-led development. So much so that I have often called India's G20 presidency an SDG 20. And I believe that the energy and the momentum from New Delhi did carry forward to New York and did help achieve a political declaration and SDG rescue plan, as the Secretary General was calling for, including many of the G20 priorities that had been put forth here, as well as an SDG stimulus and reform of the international financial architecture, a focus on just energy transitions. India was also host to many important side sessions and discussions. And I'm pleased to say that the United Nations here in India, we were a partner in some of those, including the launch of a new partnership under the guidance of the Ministry of External Affairs, together between UN and India and the Gates Foundation, to help amplify India's South-South cooperation and support to other countries in the world to help achieve the SDGs. The high-level week also saw a critical summit on raising climate ambitions. A very meaningful number of countries aligned their policies with the goal of limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. And critically, as we are discussing here this evening, businesses, asset owners, and financial institutions pledged to align their strategies and portfolios to keep 1.5 alive. Yet, as we approach COP28 in the UAE, we must continue to raise our ambitions. The curve of global emissions is bending, but it isn't happening nearly fast enough. Instead of being on track to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, they're set to actually increase by 11% by 2030. And this is why we're talking about business, and this is why we're talking about sustainable business models. Nowhere in the world are the stakes higher and the opportunities greater than right here in India. India faces the challenge of meeting energy demands that are growing, while at the same time meeting the just requirements for the right to development, to keep emissions in check, to achieve a just green transition, and, for example, as the G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant says, try to carve a new path, a path towards full industrialization, high development in a low-carbon way that the high-income countries of today did not do to become a capital for sustainability. And I would say the good news here, as we've been hearing today and we will hear tomorrow, that India is well on its way to the green transition with a dynamic private sector, with hundreds of billions being invested in renewable energy by the private sector. The fourth largest globally in terms of installed renewable capacities, committed to reach 500 gigawatts by 2030, one of the important Panchamrit targets. Solar energy capacities have increased here 11 times in the last 5 years. The Lifestyle for Environment Initiative, as I said, indicating top-level political leadership and priority. Investments in multilateral systems, the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and more. And in turn, the G20 New Delhi Declaration have all embraced global just energy transitions, the blue economy, saving biodiversity, climate finance, and tripling renewable energy by 2030 across the world. Yet so much more needs to be done. And this is why we need partnerships. Partnerships, especially with the private sector, to unlock private capital. We need all hands on deck. We need a Jan Andolan. And this means not just long-term pledges, but short-term targets and plans for emissions reduction. So again, I commend all of the businesses here today for taking part in this and for making and enforcing quantifiable targets. We've heard so much encouraging leadership on these points. And we know that the money is there. We talk about 3, maybe 4 trillion in terms of SDG financing gap, and yet we know that the global capital markets are approximately $120 trillion. It's not an issue of money. It's how we align and allocate that money. And finally, we must take advantage of the gender dividend. We must leverage the skills and equal participation in climate decision making and the green economy of women. We know the information, the data is very clear. If we bring women fully into the equation, we will unlock an additional many, many trillions of dollars. So for these reasons, the United Nations system, and certainly here in India, are very proud to work with you, to work with the private sector, with the businesses in partnership for climate action, gender equality, and sustainability. I won't go through all the many different ways that we do so, but I will simply say that we are now counting on everybody here. Again, halftime is over, the second half is starting. And to quote the Secretary General at the Climate Summit last week, it's not going to be easy, but everything that really matters needs a lot of fighting. A spirit captured in one of my favorite Jackie Schroff dialogues, if I may dare to make an attempt. Jo kam dunya ko namumkin lage, wahi mauka hota hai, kartab dikhane ka. It's exactly when the universe says, it's impossible. This is the best time to show what we can do. We know what to do, we just need to do it. Bahut bahut dhanyavad.